And first up, we have Gina, who is a professor of cognitive neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Centre at the University of Aston in Birmingham. And she's had a long and distinguished career in understanding the brain and what that means and how we interpret things. And today, she's going to be asking the question, is our brain male or female? And is there indeed a difference between a male and female brain? So sex in the brain. And this is also building on the Gendered Brain book that Gina wrote and published recently, and that's also available obviously from bookshops and Amazon and so forth if you'd like to find out more. So Gina, thank you ever so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you very much to anybody who's out there discovering a very strange new world of talking into the void. So I'm assuming I'm talking to some people. As Adrian mentioned, this talk is linked to my recent book, Gendered Brain, which, clue being in the title, is about differences between the brains of women and the brains of men. But it isn't quite the book I set out to write, and you might hear more about that aspect during the talk. It was actually about how all brains, any brains, get to be different. And my day job is as an autism researcher. And there's a great saying in the autism community, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So many different types of behavior, many different brains. Where do these differences come from? And given that I believed that every brain was different from every other brain, I wanted to call the book 50 Shades of Grey Matter, but my publishers reined me in, felt the title lacked gravitas, but also thought one difference at a time might be useful to discuss, hence the gendered brain. Okay, so sexing the brain, is your brain female or male, or are we asking the wrong question? The key issue is perhaps why we're asking this question. Issue is not really about brain anatomy, but actually about gender gaps, and the world is full of gender gaps in education, political power, positions in society, success in science and art and pay, etc., and also in certain areas of physical and mental health. So where do these gender gaps come from? Blame the brain has been a popular mantra down the ages. These gaps are caused, and I use the word advisedly, by brain differences. It was claimed that women achieved less, were less powerful, were less evident in the history of civilization because their brains were different, were wired differently. The male brain gives us man the achiever, the female brain gives us woman the wife. But that is, of course, 18th, 19th century thinking. 21st century neuroscience, with its amazing advances in technology and access to thousands and thousands of different brains, has shed a much more nuanced, better informed light on how brains get to be different. And of course, that's moved us on from this stereotypical biology is destiny type thinking about who can and can't do what, or has it. So let's have a look at where this sort of thinking came from and where it might take us next. Stepping back a bit, begin at the beginning, because actually where we began still, I think, informs the way in which we think about these issues today. The question about male and female brains is a very old question. In fact, it didn't used to be a question, it was a given. 18th, 19th century male brain scientists looked at their world as it was then, with women way down the pecking order, financially, socially, educationally, and decided that this huge gender gap was naturally, in inverted commas, determined, with women's substandard, deficient biology, particularly their vulnerable brains, the explanation for this inferiority. And the quotes I'm showing here illustrate the generally accepted view of the subject matter these early scientists were working with. Might perhaps make one question their objectivity. So they viewed women as inferior, closer to children and savages than adult civilized males. And they also did kindly acknowledge that occasionally there were exceptional women, but they were so rare that one should view them really on the same terms as a two-headed gorilla. So these scientists established a very determined hunt the difference agenda. They worked really hard to find a measure that would support this assertion. So Great Excitement discovered that you could fill a skull with birdseed, you could weigh the birdseed and estimate the size of the brain that came from that skull. And they discovered that on average, and this is an important term we'll come back to, women's brains were 5 ounces lighter than men's, surely the basis then of men's intellectual and social superiority. a triumph for the size matters argument that so commonly characterizes point scoring in this type of debate. So a slight hiccup was caused by the observation that on a purely brain size scale, creatures such as sperm whales and elephants should have outsmarted the human race, males or females. So the scientists moved on to feeling bumps on the head, chronology, or devising strange metrics of the ratio of, for example, forehead angles to earlobe lengths, a discipline called craniology, with the determined aim to prove that white, because that was part of the argument too, upper class, educated males would be the top of any scale they devised, with women lower down, with children, followed by the lower classes in inverted commas and other races. And we should notice the fact that if the metrics didn't come up with this answer, then the metrics were dropped. It was a given that men's and women's brains were different, and if the science didn't prove that, then there was something wrong with the science. And I think we should park that thought. So what chain of argument was established by this hunt the difference agenda? I've tried to summarize the traditional issues, perhaps rather overambitiously, in a single slide. The starting point of the argument is that whatever causes anatomical differences in females and males also causes brain differences. So biological females will have a female brain, biological males will have a male brain. Note at this point, we're just talking about two types of body. Brains should be sexed in the same way that bodies can be, and the differences should be visible by some means in the two types of brain. Remember, at this point or early on, we didn't have access to intact living human brains. So brain differences were innate, biologically determined, and female differences, female and male brains were different from the very beginning of life. So this is, if you like, the sort of sex end of the argument. Boy brains arrived in the world already showing signs of the kind of skills that would carry them on to great achievement, courtesy of a prenatal marinade of testosterone. Although again, the early brain scientists weren't aware of this, but not only determined the type of genitals they would have, but also organised their brains along appropriate lines, suited early on for the rigours of education and later for their predestined success. So after about late teens, early 20s, the brains had grown to full size to a fixed developmental endpoint, and we'll come back to that as well, well equipped with powers of logic and reason, bravery and independence, Nobel Prize winning aptitudes, leaders of government and business, man the achiever. Girl brains would not normally have had the benefit of high levels of testosterone, so would already be different. The brain's owner would be less likely to acquire her brother's man the achiever skills. Indeed, 19th century thinking suggested the female brain was so fragile that it shouldn't be exposed to the dangers of education. She might succumb to a debilitating condition called anorexia scholastica, which could damage her brain and certainly her reproductive system. So this fragile little brain arrived similarly at a predetermined, fixed and inevitable developmental endpoint. Bit princessy, emotionally labile, but ideally suited to be, and I quote, a womanly companion to man, a good wife and mother. These brain differences are causally linked to well-known behavior or personality differences. So having a lady brain would make you good at empathy, but rubbish at map reading. Having a manly brain would make you good at science type thinking, but rubbish at listening or managing emotions. The classic Mars-Venus trope. And you can or should be able to find the source of such differences in the brain. So women should, for example, have a bigger empathy center and men a bigger science center. And these different portfolios of skills then causally, again, determine that females and males are constitutionally made for different roles or occupations, for different levels of achievement, different places in society. And this would historically be defined as the gender end of the argument, with gender as a sort of social construct linked to external stereotypical norms of sex-appropriate roles and behaviours, as well as internalised processes such as self-identity or sense of femininity or masculinity. So a nice, neat, straightforward, binary set of categories at each stage, with the links between these stages fixed and unidirectional. Biology's destiny. Now, this essentialist belief, another word we'll come back to, has its roots then way back in the 19th century. But I really believe that it still, as we shall see, underpins beliefs about differences between males and females and can still be found in much contemporary 21st century thinking. And a good example of this is found in Simon Baron-Cohen's book, which I think typifies much of the some of the current thinking about different sex differences between males and females. His book is called The Essential Difference, with essential here to do with some kind of biological essence, but quite probably conveying a different meaning. If you heard the word essential, you may well assume that we're talking about something that's really important, really necessary, shouldn't be messed around with. And the opening lines of this book claim the female brain, so there is such a thing, is hardwired, i.e. fixed or soldered by some kind of phenotypical program for empathy. So again, linked to particular sex differences in behavior or personality, which Simon Baron-Cohen claims makes them wonderful carers and nursery nurses. The male brain is hardwired for understanding systems, to a list of high-achieving, powerful jobs. And additionally, you can guarantee that if there's a neuroscience finding somewhere in the world which suggests, even tentatively, that they might have found sex differences in the brain, it will be leapt on with excited enthusiasm by the popular press. Usually headlines along the line of proof at last, or at last the truth. And an example here from last year's Times, proof at last. Women and men are born to be different. Thank goodness these scientists have caught up with what we knew all along. But remember that these conclusions about male and female brains were arrived at long before we could properly study intact, living, undamaged brains in intact, living, undamaged human beings, carrying out the kind of tasks that seem to separate women from men. So along came brain imaging in the 1990s. And these are the kind of images that were beginning to be produced then, and which characterize the sort of images which illustrate any brain imaging neuroscience research today, and the kind of images that I have collected in my lab at Aston. Nice, clear pictures of different structures in the brain and particular patterns of activation color-coded on different areas of the brain. Wonderfully compelling images. But there are several problems with this. They give the impression that we have a handle on what's really going on in brains in real time. We have a genuine real-time window into what was happening in anyone's brain as it happened. But it wasn't clear that these images are actually the end product of a very long line of statistical decisions, statistical manipulation, image smoothing, complicated averaging across all your participants. None of it fraudulent, but really not the kind of real-time viewing that it seemed. And most importantly, isn't made clear that these images are specifically designed to emphasize differences. Any similarity between the groups or the individuals that you're looking at are averaged out. The thresholds are cranked up on those voxels or little parts of the images which did show differences, and the differences were then carefully color-coded to make sure they really showed up. So we started to get a whole narrative about brains lighting up differently in females and males, about different size emotion centers in women, or different locations for language centers in males and females. And this is a very early example. You get this. This is a very early example, claiming to show that women use both sides of their brain to process language, whereas men only use one side. And this fitted in neatly with all sorts of existing beliefs, with an important characteristic that we'll see later. So the trouble is that nobody has been able to reliably replicate this finding, and many reviews have questioned the methods and the interpretation of the data. But this image has amazing stickability. The paper's been cited nearly 2,000 times, and you can still find the image itself sculling around in underinformed text and on slightly dubious websites, often peddling the notion of single-sex education. So the images are very powerful, but with respect to really addressing the question of whether male and female brains are different, these images are often part of the problem rather than the solution. And they were also behind a tidal wave of, and I need to go back, I think, to show you this, of brain-based self-help books, cheerily hijacking sex differences research, and the images in particular, and making forthright claims about, at last, the truth again, neuroscience at last providing the evidence as to why men don't cry, can't iron, like straight lines, women are caring and multitasking, can't read maths, like polka dots, etc. Ghastly tomes such as the female brain, one of the worst examples of this particular genre, and the granddaddy of them all, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And I cheekily called these type of books neurotrash, which did cause me problem in one particular talk that I was giving, when it turned out that the authors of one of the books I'd so dubbed was in the audience, which did make the question and answer session quite lively afterwards. But these neurotrash books continue to provide enormously powerful support for society's firmly established and generally widely accepted stereotypes about men and women, both their brains and their behavior and the links between the two. Toxic stuff like this has a long half-life and actually powerfully informs the kind of attitudes which we now understand to be brain-changing, as I will come to shortly. What about the genuine science? Have decades of neuroimaging research managed to pin down those crucial differences between men's and women's brains? To date, the answer is surprisingly no, they haven't. There are many, many papers published every month proclaiming that they found sex differences in a particular area or pathway in the brain, frequently followed up by the breathless at last the truth headlines I mentioned earlier. And these papers are peer-reviewed, published in prestigious journals. But if you step back and really delve into the depths of these findings, or actually compare different papers, you can see that there are just as many papers which report different differences in different areas, or report that they didn't find differences in the areas that were hailed as definitively different just the last week or the month before. As fast as one paper proclaims differences, another set comes along saying they can't find any consistent evidence of differences. So you can get big surveys of measures of, for example, the human amygdala, which then claim, actually, if you look at all the papers and add them up together, there is no difference between male and female brains. And it's worth pondering that these are the papers that are published. If you start out with the idea that there is a difference and you don't find one, you may well not submit your paper for publication, or it may be rejected anyway. If you didn't find a sex difference, you must be doing something wrong. Shades of our 19th century phrenology, craniology arguments here. So there is as yet no one area or network of areas in the brain which reliably and unequivocally distinguishes male and female brains. I cannot point to a brain image and infallibly identify it as belonging to the brain of a man or the brain of a woman. I cannot pick a man or a woman out of the audience and reliably predict what their brain will be like. So I'm afraid it's not like the forensic pathologist in TV police procedurals who can pick up a bone and firmly declare that the owner of this bone was a 34-year-old woman who had 3 children and arthritis and like a drop of skin. The data we've got so far has not been able to tell the difference between male and female brains. Another part of the problem is that neuroscientists themselves are sometimes less than cautious in reporting their findings. You can often come across the use of terms like profound and fundamental, which are, of course, very attractive to those journalists looking for some, at last, the truth fodder, to describe tiny differences between two hugely overlapping sets of data. And it's worth bearing in mind that we are talking about tiny differences between data from males and data from females. And I've mentioned the term on average before, and this is what we're looking at here. 2 sets of data show huge amounts of variability within each group, far more than the differences between them. And yet the focus is always on these tiny average differences. It seems much more interesting to understand why, particularly for somebody like me who wants to know how and why brains get to be different, that we actually have a look at why in each of these supposedly biologically homogeneous groups, male or female, there is so much variability. And rather than truffling around focusing on these tiny little group average differences that we see here. The other confession that as a neuroscientist I should make is that we might just painted ourselves into a corner here by focusing on sizes of different structures, or even pathways in the brain, to see if we can find the source of those pesky gender gaps we're trying to explain. We really aren't all that clear as to why having a bigger amygdala or a smaller hippocampus or a thinner cortex, what that might mean in explaining certain types of behavior, or even harder, different types of personality or preferences. So we must beware phrases such as decades of neuroscience research have shown that female and male brains are different. They might not just be telling the whole story. So, does the 21st century field of brain science have anything new to offer on this debate? If you've stuck with me this far, you'll be pleased to hear the answer is yes. And it's what I call the inside out, outside in model of brain function. Our brains interact with the world much more than we thought, inside out, but the world has a much more powerful influence on our brains than we suspected, outside in. And you might think this is a recasting of the old nature or nurture arguments, but it's much more to do with a demonstration that biology and culture and society are inextricably entangled, that our brains can be changed just as much by events going on in the outside world as by genetically determined events inside the brain. So let's have a look and see at the kind of progress that 21st century has made to enable us to start looking at differences in the brain in a new way. And this brings me to my 3 Ps of the 21st century understanding of how our brains work. And apologies if alliteration sets your teeth on edge, but hopefully it'll make these things more memorable. These 3 Ps are that our brains are predictive, they're plastic, and they're permeable. Our predictive brains then. Our brains appear to act like a mixture between predictive texters and high-end sat-navs. They're not just hugely efficient, reactive or receptive information processors, which they actually act like the deep learning systems, so beloved of artificial intelligence. They're proactively rule-gathering, self-teaching systems, which constantly monitor what's going on outside their owners' heads, make predictions about what's going to happen next, and importantly, note when things don't go as expected, which in brain science terms is called a prediction error. So effectively, the brain is checking out what happens when you hear a particular sound, see a particular sight, the end even of a particular sentence, the outcome of a particular social interaction, as we'll come to later. So it's actually a guessing game, which is driving you through the world in a particular way and saying, this is what's going to happen next, do this. And I have to say, it's actually not necessarily a minutely detailed and universally accurate set of rules. It's more of a hand-wavy, quick and dirty, that will do set, with a major aim being to make good enough predictions and shortcuts and move on to the next problem and solution. The key thing to note here is the flexibility and responsivity of this brain is not the quite the fixed and hardwired image of the traditional essentialist view. Our brains are plastic. Our adult brains are not inevitably hardwired as we used to think. They're plastic and flexible and actually constantly changing. And we used to think that once our brains had stopped growing postnatally, they stayed pretty much the same until old age or disease intervened. And now we know that this isn't true, and that even as adults, structures and functions in our brains can be changed by different experiences, different occupations, even different hobbies or sports. And the most famous example of plasticity is the well-known London taxi driver studies carried out by UCL neuroscientist Eleanor McGuire and her team. And they showed that the years of doing the knowledge, which is behind learning to be a black cab driver in London, which requires memorizing different routes through the 20,000 or so London streets within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross, now you know. This resulted in grey matter increases in the parts of the brain concerned with spatial cognition and memory. This wasn't just because this part of the brain was already bigger. What was really intriguing that she tracked both learners and retirees and mapped increases in the former and decreases in the latter. It wasn't just because the taxi drivers were having to navigate complex driving routes And this is what had changed their brain, because she also looked at bus drivers who had fixed routes, and they didn't show this effect. And there are many, many other studies which show the waxing and waning of brain structures and functions when their owners are exposed to different training opportunities. But we have to think then that if brain changing experiences are different for different people or different groups of people, how might that be shown in the brain? If, for example, being male means that you have much greater experiences of constructing things or manipulating complex 3D representations, it's very likely that this will show up in your brain. So brains will reflect the lives they have lived, the outside-in aspect of this model. Finally, our brains are permeable. We now know that quite probably as part of its sat-naving type activity, task-related brain activity can change as a function of the attitudes and expectations associated with doing the task. Is this something you're expected to do well at? Is it something that people like you struggle with? These outside influences are reflected in how your brain solves the problem it's set. Now, stereotype threat is a concept in social psychology that refers to the process whereby if you're a member of a group identified as generally performing poorly at a particular task, say women and map reading, and this reputation for poor performance is drawn to your attention just before you're asked to carry out such a task, you'll generally underperform. And this process has perhaps been shown to be a bit overhyped to the extent to which it can change behaviour, but it has been shown that it can affect how the brain works. So neuroscientist Mary Jane Raga scanned 3 groups of women who'd been asked to carry out a spatial cognition task, telling one group that this was a task that women were generally bad at. They got a negative message. Another group that this was a task that generally women did rather well at, positive message, with a third control group being given a neutral message. And the patterns of mistakes showed the predicted difference. Those with a positive message did better than those with a negative message. But it was also associated with different patterns of brain activity, with the positive groups showing patterns of activation in the appropriate task-related areas, whereas the negative groups showed much more activities in emotional control and error evaluate systems, which we'll meet again shortly. So exactly the same task, but the brains dealt with it differently when it encountered different expectations of success. So we have a new understanding that our brains are predictive, are plastic, are permeable. So if we want to understand how brains get to be different, we must start to focus just as much on what's going on outside our brains as what's going on inside. The next part of this complicated jigsaw is a new take on what our, I should add at this point that the other part of the jigsaw is that this starts very early on, that we now understand that our brains are wired to make us social. Sorry, no, I need to take you back a bit on this. Okay, this is a new take on what our brains are for, that our brains are wired to make us social, are made to make us pay attention to what's going on in our social circles. And the early stages of brain imaging mainly focused on those skills which were thought to uniquely set human beings apart from others. The fact that we developed language, could coolly and logically process huge amounts of complex information, could plan, create, invent. This was firmly linked to the newest part of our brains, our prefrontal cortex, coded here by images of Sherlock Holmes and Albert Einstein. And yes, I had noticed they're both males. But a newer view of our brain is that our success is based more on our ability to be social, to have intricate social relationships with other brain owners, to form elaborate social networks, to solve problems collaboratively, to understand our own identity and how it relates to our in-groups or out-groups. It's claimed that the success of the human race is linked to the ability of our brains to trawl their owners' worlds for social rules, social scripts, patterns of social behavior. And they will drive their owners down a route of socially appropriate behaviours, of guaranteed in-group membership, or supporting the importance of belonging to a social group or groups, all linked to self-identity, literally, who am I, how should I behave, where do I fit in? And the sophisticated social activity of our prefrontal cortex is linked to the evolutionarily older parts of our brain in charge of emotions, so driving positive emotions, such as joy and happiness, and negative emotions such as sadness and fear. which will provide the positive or negative colouring to our social interactions, and perhaps give them, if you like, approach or avoid tags. And there's an additional inhibitory go-no-go system in the brain, which I've spent a lot of my time studying in my research career. Depicted here is a kind of traffic lights, railway points combo, which can help us navigate the tortuous roads of social behaviour, guaranteed in group membership, driving us down a route of socially appropriate behaviours. Its main role is as a kind of sophisticated braking system or inner limiter, actually helping us avoid social mistakes or socially inappropriate behaviour, or behaviour that's deemed to be socially inappropriate. So back to the picture of our baby, and that's the additional new understanding in this hard story. We're wired to be social right from the moment of birth. New brain imaging techniques have given us new insights into baby brains as well as adult ones. And it turns out that baby brains are not the underdeveloped, merely reactive subcortical organs that they were thought to be, go with being hugely dependent and helpless at birth, and for quite a long time afterwards. From the moment of birth, or even perhaps before, human babies are tuned to pick up on social cues, to spot the characteristics that identify their significant others and the rules of social engagement in their world. Within hours or days or weeks, they're responding differently to faces rather than scrambled images, to the sound of their caregiver's voice, to the sound of their own native language as opposed to others. They pay attention to these rules, social engagement. Babies are hugely absorbent little socialites, making sure they know the rules of the club by watching very closely the rules of that club as they play out in the outside world. It turns out that all the activities and processes involved in being social are clearly brain-driven processes, and negative social experiences, it's positive, can have powerful brain-changing effects and have a really powerful effect on the self-esteem of participants and their behaviour. We're now starting to understand that we have a need to be social, a need to belong, a need to maintain high levels of positive self-esteem. I have been involved in some of this work over the years, and it strikes me that I've been rather unkind, putting unfortunate volunteers in scanners and making them carry out tasks designed to lower their self-esteem, and show how these can powerfully activate their brain, particularly the go-no-go inner limiter system we met earlier. How about modelling social rejection? Get participants to play a simple ball-throwing video game where the other players seem suddenly to stop throwing the ball to you, carry on having a great time without you. Set up a Tinder-type task where you enthusiastically swipe right on images of others you would like to meet, only to see these others rapidly swiping left on your image, possibly rubbing it in by adding a 0 rating on the would like to meet scale, a real dent in your self-esteem. Perhaps you'd like to muse where you are in the pecking order, at work, in your social network, in your worldview. Somewhere down the bottom of this particular ladder doesn't do great things for your self-image. How about eliciting some self-criticism? Think of the last mistake you made. How stupid was that? How many job rejections have you had? Did they make you feel you really shouldn't have bothered? So on and on and on, I'm afraid. A common factor in all the patterns of brain activity associated with such social torture is the activation of this go-no-go inhibitory system I showed you in the last slide. And it has been pointed out, the same areas of the brain that are activated when your self-esteem is dented are the same areas activated when you suffer real pain. So negative social experiences, from social rejection to poor self-image to self-blame, can be shown to be hugely powerful driving forces within the brain. What goes on outside the brain will powerfully change what goes on inside. We have brains that need to engage with the world in order to work out the rules of social engagement, to check out in-group characteristics, make sure the right sort of fitting in is going on. And our predictive, plastic, permeable brains will be out there getting the social navigation data the world is offering to make sure, in sat-nav terms, that we don't end up jammed under a bridge. So If we want to understand how brains get to be different, then we should be inspecting this outside world for the kind of rules or experiences or attitudes that might bring about any differences, just as much as we should be transcribing genomes or assaying hormone levels or devising ever more detailed ways of measuring brain structure and function. Now, you may have noticed that we've drifted away from the topic of sex or gender or both. But now we know how important the outside world is to establishing brain differences. If, say, we wanted to understand the sex-related brain bases of the gender gaps we're interested in, now we can start to investigate potentially brain-changing processes that we might find in our society. Is there any evidence that just possibly the outside world might have different attitudes and expectations of females as compared to males? Certainly clear in the 19th century era of two-headed gorilla type thinking. But might we just possibly find evidence of rule-driving gender stereotypes in our contemporary world? You bet. There are many, many ways in which we could investigate how our world emphasizes the differences between females and males, and how these different pressures will impact differently on our rule-gathering, plastic, permeable brains. But here are 4 quick examples of potentially brain-changing phenomena in our outside world. Our gendered attitude to newborns and babies, the gendered toys we give our children to play with, gendered experience and expectations in education, and a hobby horse of mine, but a nice case study, gendered beliefs in science. So just quickly to talk you through these and remind you of how these will generate experiences and attitudes and awareness of rules that males and females are different. So, gendered attitudes to newborns. Nothing signals to me more the overemphasis in our 21st century world on beliefs about the differences between males and females than those ghastly gender reveal parties. 20 weeks into a pregnancy, a scan will identify pretty reliably whether the child to arrive is a male or a female. Cue excuses for invitations with ghastly questions such as touchdowns or tutus, princesses or football players, etc. You'll arrive at the party, you'll be given pink or blue balloons, pink or blue fireworks will be set off, recently setting off a wildfire in California. And effectively what this clues up to me is that 20 weeks before these tiny humans even arrive on our planet, we're flagging up that one of the most important distinctions in the world in which they're about to arrive is whether you're male or female. And once they arrive, there's this pink or blue tsunami which washes over them. And this can affect their behavior. We know that, for example, by 2 years old, boys are rejecting toys if they're colored pink, toys which they would quite happily have been playing with earlier. And toys are another battleground. Gendered toy marketing is big business these days. If you can pink or blue it, then do it. And it matters. If the choice is between the creative training opportunities offered by, say, construction toys, or the fantasy world offered by princess castles and Barbie dolls, then we should look very carefully at who gets given such toys. There is evidence that the alleged robust, powerful sex differences in spatial skills in favour of males, key for many aspects of science and construction, may in fact be due to differences in spatial experiences, such as what toys you play with, what hobbies you have, or sports you play. Measures looking at such differences between males and females, if you then ask those males and females what experiences they had with toys, what hobbies they have, etc., and then go back to the data, the sex differences will disappear. It's the experiences you had, the gendered experiences you had, which might lead to these differences in ability. And the key thing is, you might say that surely the world offers girls just the same kind of experiences. Well, my favorite example is this toy here, where Mattel, being aware of the underrepresentation of women in science, produced Barbie the Engineer, a doll neatly dressed up in a very short lab coat and very high heels, who can make, quote, a pink washing machine or a pink jewelry carousel. So I would submit the boys and girls quite likely, via the toys they play with, have different gendered experiences, which may well lead to different changes in their brain. And schools recently took part in a BBC documentary called No More Boys and Girls, Can Our Girls Go Gender Free? And it was clear in the making of this video that schools are an amazing source of gendered expectations. These were 7-year-old children who, and the girls and boys already had very different expectations of what they might be when they grow up, the kind of things they were good at, the kind of things they were bad at. You could have a look around your local nursery. Is there any evidence of gendered toys, gendered dressing up boxes? A primary school. Are the boys and girls segregated for games, for different activities? Do they, and this was true in the school that we were working in, do they have different coloured cupboards for the coats they hang, where they can hang their coats? Does anybody know why? Do they line up differently? Going to a secondary school, what subjects are girls advised to do? What subjects are boys advised to do? So lots of opportunity for the brains of our junior gender detectives to pick up the not so subtle clues that boys and girls are different, should wear different clothes, read different books, play with different toys, study different subjects, be expected to follow different career paths. And of course, this is all part of your self-image, of the feeling where you are in the pecking order in science, in society, which we've already noted as a brain-changing phenomenon. Finally, then, gender beliefs in science. The underrepresentation of women in science and the reasons behind it is something of a hobby horse of mine, which you may have picked up. But it does make a nice case study for the possibly brain-changing consequences of a culture that treats one group as likely to be inferior, will almost certainly be incompetent, and ideally should be steered away from key aspects of science altogether. This is a rogues gallery of high-profile male scientists who took it upon themselves to criticise the presence of women in science, or to justify their absence, by trotting out our old 19th century argument that these women haven't got the right kind of biology. And there's a whole other talk about how science treats men and women differently at all and every level of recruitment, of promotion and reward. And if you were a girl pondering a future career in science, your social brain might be flagging furiously that this is not your in-group. You won't be welcome. Your self-esteem will take a hammering. Like our predictive brains, make a U-turn as soon as possible. So this is an example of how now we know that events in the outside world can change the brain. We can look into that outside world and see if there are such events. And of course, to think positively, these are events that we can address. Is there anything else in the outside world still washing around that we should be aware of? And this brings me back to another favourite topic, that of neurotrash. Have we taken out the neurotrash? Have we got away from this old at last the truth and misleading findings about science? Well, I'm afraid it's still the case that alarming cases of Chinese whispers can still occur in the popular press. The search for at last the truth type headlines goes on. And recent events have shown the importance of communicating the science behind events or beliefs, but equally important is communicating it correctly. So I've indicated there's a well-entrenched belief that the world has always known that men and women have different brains, and this is enthusiastically fed by the popular press. But here's just a couple of quick examples to finish off, so that we need to be really careful about what we're being told. Here we have a headline trumpeting a finding that social behaviour, particularly linked to aggression and dominance, is different in men and women, and that neuroscientists have found the biological basis for this. And we have nice little cross sections of male and female brains, human brains, helpfully coloured pink and blue. It's not until you get to the small print, where a few details of the study are offered, when we learn that this study was actually carried out on hamsters. Second example was one I was more directly involved in, having been asked to comment on a quite worthy and dense paper reporting evidence of varying levels of maternal aggression in female mice associated with particular brain cells. Not great research with some serious methodological issues, and I returned my comments and forgot about it. Several weeks later, a sex differences in the brain Google alert sent me to a lurid article about the brain bases for sadomasochistic behavior in men and women. And as this is a family event, I thought I'd better censor the accompanying image. So we now know that science explains why some people are into BDSM and some aren't. And perhaps I won't even read out the accompanying text. The article itself didn't identify the research paper they were talking about, but imagine my surprise when a certain amount of detective work took me back to the mouse paper I'd airily dismissed a few weeks earlier. If attitudes and expectations can change the brain, then we need to be very, very careful that those attitudes and expectations are based on accurate information. So to close then, I believe we need to revisit this age assumption about the predetermined pathways along which the brains of women and the brains of men will develop, that there is such a thing as a female brain or a male brain, and these two are very different, and every other differences arise because of them. That's not to say that I believe there are no sex differences in the brain, and I and colleagues like me have been publicly vilified as sex difference deniers, like climate change deniers, presumably with the same dire consequences for the human race. For sure, there are differences between male and female brains, both in the tiny details of the neural real estate we haven't yet been able to spot, and certainly in the various hormones that partly fuel brain processes. We are indeed looking at the unrolling of a biological script, but it is a script playing out on a social stage. These brains will encounter many deviations, roots barred, distractions along the way. And the differences we arrive at may be much more a function of those brain-changing life events than the unfolding of this biological script. I believe it's clear that what sex is the sufferer, the underachiever, the science dropout, if we're looking at gender gaps, even lousy map reader, that should not be the first and only question that's asked. So I'm hoping that you'll share my take-home messages. Brains reflect the lives they've lived, not just the sex of their owners. And a gendered world produces a gendered brain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What a fascinating journey into the brain and some of the research that's been done on that. I mean, in terms of the imaging techniques that you referred to and how they've come on over the years, what's happening in how well are those improving what your understanding of the brain is? Are they getting better at resolution? Are they? What's happening there?
Yes, great question. I mean, I think one of the things, with the funny picture of my brain's bigger than yours, was really the idea that I think neuroscience, with respect to this particular question, has sort of painted itself into a corner by focusing, the missing 5 ounces on the sizes of structures. So yes, we're getting very, very good at getting minute details of different structures, but we're not really sure about how those relate to behavior. And if it was just an anatomical question, then that's fine. We can go into more and more anatomical detail, but we're actually generally more interested in the significance of any differences we find for the individuals concerned. So I think the new techniques, which are much more looking at how the brain functions, looking at different frequencies of brainwave activity, what I call listening to the language of the brain, as opposed to studying the structures. I think that will move us on much more, but hopefully the focus will be on individual differences, looking at brain activity as a kind of fingerprint, so we could work out how everybody's different from everybody else, which clearly are, and really get the brain basis of that. So the techniques are moving on, but we need to extract ourselves from this, continued focus on bigger is better, or depending on who has the bigger or smaller brain, maybe smaller is more streamlined, for example.
Yeah. Yes. Interesting. Yeah. So we have a question from the audience. So I'm going to read it out. So Alan asks, could one say that the brain is wired to live and therefore avoid danger long enough to reproduce rather than being wired to be social? What's your thought on that?
Well, I think actually those two are quite powerfully linked. And that's possibly why babies are hardwired. Babies are wired to be social right from the beginning, because I think being social is a matter of survival. And that's equally true in the human race, if you like, as in non-human animals, although I do have views on the relevance of non-human animal studies to this question. So yes, we're wired to live, but we're wired to survive, and I think being social is part of that survival mechanism. So we need to find out how we survive, and that could be by being social just as much as understanding language or being aware, right back at the very beginning of whether you should, fight or flight, hide, attack, whatever.
And I guess the meaning of being social has changed or evolved over the years as well. I mean, our lives are much more, I would say, complex than maybe when we were than for our ancestors when we were hunting or just trying to survive.
Yes.
Now we have many more inputs, whether this is social media or, different ways of interacting with people. I mean, do you think that also plays a role in, that plasticity of the brain that you talked about?
I think it does. And I mean, what always strikes me is how such a personal, subjective feeling of self-esteem, you can A, manipulate that, and B, it has powerful brain changing effects. So I think when it's more than just a question of I'm going to die if I don't stick with my group. If it's a question of my group isn't impressed with me, my group is bullying me online, getting into cyberbullying, etc. And that can have a powerful effect on self-esteem. And the end of that, there is a pathological aspect of that. Most of the serious mental illnesses, which actually distinguish males and females in epidemiological terms, are disorders of self-esteem, such as depression and self-image. So I think I'm possibly drifting away from your question, sorry, but yes, I mean, I think it's still a survival mechanism, and a survival mechanism which still has mortal consequences. Eating disorders, for example, has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric problem. So the need to be social is a very fundamental, I use that word carefully, aspect of human behaviour.
Right, interesting. So we've also had some comments on Facebook. So I did get the Facebook stream to go soon after you started, but I think it was a few minutes in. So you mentioned right at the beginning of your talk about autism, and there is a question. It's to do with if the brains are trying to maximise social achievement, have you looked at how autistic brains might be different?
Indeed, yes, for quite a long time.
Yes,
yes, I mean, autism autism is very interesting in this particular question. Autism as a problem of social interaction and social communication, and apologies if this sounds kind of clinically cold, is a very good case study of how important social communication is in behaviour. And if you don't automatically understand the rules of social communication, your behaviour is automatically and almost invariably identified as unusual or odd by other people and by yourself. So social behaviour as a brain-based process can be studied in autistic individuals. The other aspect, which also links to Simon Baron-Cohen, is the idea that autism is a male problem. And this is claimed as a classic sex difference, which is why we should study sex differences in order to understand things like autism. And it's one of those areas of self-fulfilling prophecy, which is true of all sorts of stereotypes, where it's now becoming clear that there are many, many girls and women on the autistic spectrum who have not been identified, have taken years to be identified, struggled with all sorts of behavioural problems, when really early on, if somebody had spotted that they were on, they could have had the help they needed. So that's a classic example of a gendered lens narrowing the focus and missing a huge amount of variability. So yes, studying autism and understanding autism on many aspects of this question is really important, and it's where the two parts of my own research come together.
Yeah, and there's so much more to learn. I mean, in terms of the younger members that are watching this today, what sort of advice do you have for them if they want a career in studying the brain, if they're interested in learning more as their job? What should they do? Okay. So, they may be at school at the moment.
Yeah, well, one of the great things about studying the brain is it involves all sorts of different specializations. So working in the brain center, there are physicists and engineers who are looking at the kind of signal end of things. There are psychologists who are devising the kind of tasks nasty tasks about getting people to be self-critical, etc. And there are people who can even, autistic individuals who help brain images characterize the images or the data they produce into images which hopefully communicate or sometimes miscommunicate their story. So I was always fascinated by the brain from a very early age. I think the brain is just a fascinating organ to study. I think it's the basis of why we are who we are. And so you can involve yourself in any aspects. And of course, there is the clinical, the applied end, understanding how behavior can become atypical because of brain processes. So it's a great career. I would firmly put it in the kind of science category, although I think, again, that sometimes a dichotomy like that is unfortunate. So if there are girls out there interested in the brain, then there are perhaps additional barriers that you'll need to confront, careers, teachers that you'll need to disagree with, peers that you'll need to disagree with when you say you want to be a scientist. But if being a scientist means you can study the brain, then there are barriers well worth overcoming.
No, good. Yes, so we should encourage as many who are watching that are interested to take up the challenge, because in terms of our understanding of the brain, you've shown us today, well, that there's a vast amount of research that has been done. We're making great progress, but it's still actually a huge mystery, isn't it? Really?
Oh yes, we're in the foothills, right in the foothills. You talked about technological advances, which are fantastic, but all they really do is show us how much more complex the problem is than we ever dreamed. Yeah. And there's a great saying, if the brain was so simple we could understand it, we would be too simple to understand it. So
yes,
it's the kind of paradox there.
It is. It's
we'll never get there, but I think we can be more subtle and nuanced than we used to be, and then just the male-female issue. It's not just the case that there's two types of brain, male brains like this, male brains like that. So we hopefully move beyond that, but perhaps not as far as we could have done.
Yeah. And my final question, I don't see any others on our platform, but you mentioned and alluded to some of the animal studies of animal brains. How much can we learn from studying this? Well, I'm assuming a simpler brain in an animal, and then extrapolating that forward to our much more complicated human or monkey brains.
Yeah, a good question. I think, I slightly mocked the idea that this idea of social behaviour was studied in hamsters and therefore clearly had nothing to do with males and females. And I think there's certainly information we can get. For example, how hormones work was all based on non-human animals. And there are some natural experiments where humans are exposed to different kinds of hormones and how that can apparently change their brains, although that's not really been clearly demonstrated, or could change their behavior, which has been more powerfully demonstrated. But I think when we come to humans, the power of being social is much more powerful in humans. And therefore, things like self-esteem, for example, if we believe that's a very powerful driver and affects our behavior, you can't really study that. You can study some of that in hierarchies in animals, but even things like hormones are much more susceptible to the pressure of society and humans. So, testosterone levels will vary in fathers depending on whether they're the primary carer of a newborn baby or not the primary carer. So, same social event, but your role in that social event will be reflected in biological changes, which you don't see in within groups of male and female animals.
Good. Well, thank you ever so much, Gina. That was really fascinating. The internet held out, so that was fantastic. Yes. Excellent. And really fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the questions, and I hope you get to enjoy the rest of the festival. I will too. Yes. So I might see you later.
Thank you. Okay. Indeed. Right. So we're just going to take a 10-minute break now, and we've got Andrew Hansen joining us as I speak, but we've got 10 minutes just to sort of allow everybody to have a break and then come back, and we'll reconvene at 1:45 on schedule when Andrew will do his talk, and he's thumbs up there, so he's ready to go as well. So just bear with us 5-10 minutes and then we'll be back. Thank you very much, Gina, and see you all in a second.
Thank you.